The last city on Ver lay beneath a bruised sky, its towers cut like ribs against the storm. Emergency beacons pulsed from broken spires, each a heartbeat of a dying world. Wind pushed ash and cinders down the boulevard where triage tents sagged beneath the weight of grief. And yet the air carried another, stranger scent, ozone and iron, like the sky had opened its veins. War had not come to Ver. It had merely been born there again, in smaller ways. A reactor shielding failure that cascaded into an orbital crash, a militia shelling a spaceport to keep it for themselves, a dozen small mistakes uncoiling into catastrophe. What remained were the survivors, walking through smoke like dreams that chose not to end. Inside the largest tent, away from the press of civilians and soot-faced volunteers, a human medic worked with quiet intensity. His name was Mason Hale, a surname like a promise. His hospital badge melted into a faceless rectangle by heat. Lines of fatigue etched his eyes deeper than his years. He moved as if time had been reduced to a map, and he knew every shortcut: tourniquet, pressure, drip, whisper. His hair clung to his forehead. His hands were steady. On the cot before him lay a being not of Ver nor earth, a Selenari, her skin a pale shade of midnight, as if night itself were poured under glass. Silver veins traced patterns down her throat, twining into a crest across her sternum. She had the posture of someone born to command, even sprawled half-conscious, even drowning in her own blood. The name strip on her uniform carried two glyphs and a word his translator breathed into his ear: Kelari. "Stay," he murmured, not sure if she knew the word. "Stay with me." Her eyes opened, a luminous gray, unfocused at first, then locking onto the silhouette of a human leaning over her. Her pupils tightened. Recognized that look. Not fear exactly, cataloging. Predators catalog, so do soldiers. "Hail," she said. The translator chimed his name back to him. Her own voice was a low chord, oddly resonant. "You volunteer in a foreign war." "This isn't a war," Mason said. He could see where the shrapnel had pierced beneath the clavicle, deep enough to breach the alveolar crest equivalent. She was hemorrhaging, slow and stubborn, a sinking ship refusing to surrender to the sea. "This is a rescue." "Rescues," she said, "are just quieter wars." He didn't argue. He pressed a gloved hand over the wound and felt the skin's strange coolness, the texture fine as polished stone. His other hand threaded a line into a vessel near the wrist. Her anatomy map hovered on the tent holo, courtesy of an old, inadequate Selenari physiology text. Their red, no, silver, cells carried a heme analog bound to luminant salts. Human blood would be toxic in minutes. That should have ended the discussion, except there were no Selenari units left. The disaster had eaten their reserves, and their Arkship had limped back to orbit sealed for quarantine. Mason had already called the orbital to beg. The connection fell to static. He looked at her levels. Numbers tumbled toward zero like a cliff's edge. This was the calculus of triage, where mathematics married morality and both died together. "Kelari," he said softly, "you're dying." She blinked slowly. "I have died before," she said. "It did not last." Her hands twitched, reflex of reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. She looked past him at the tense, rippled canvas, at the shadows moving beyond, people being saved, people being lost. "I command a detachment," she added, breath hitching. "I should be in the field." "You are the field," Mason said. He tapped the screen to bring up her vitals again, closing out the error that told him what he already knew. "We can seal the wound, but you don't have the volume. Your heart won't find anything to push." His own blood type flashed in his mind, a genetic signature memorized in military triage outposts years ago. O negative, the universal donor for humans, not for her. Then, she managed, let it end quickly. Mason stood very still. Outside, thunder coughed across the city and the lights flickered. He remembered a field hospital in the valles of Mars, when a dust storm turned the sky black and the generators wheezed like dying beasts. He remembered a child whose lungs could grasp only rust and grit, and how he'd held a tiny mask against her face and whispered a story about rivers. "This isn't how we go," he said. He moved. In a crate at the foot of the cot lay an experimental module despised by half the hospital, bioadaptive microvectors, illegal in 3 systems, tolerated in 17, understood in none. They called them stitchers. Designed to translate between biochemical dialects, to barter compatibility between alien tissues that insisted on speaking alone. They were human-made but half-feral, drawn from the same stubborn impulse that had always refused to accept that an edge was the end of a path. He had watched them salvage lives when ethics committees had needed an extra hour to debate what was right. He keyed the module open. Blue lights woke like eyes along the casing. Kelari watched, eyes narrowed. "That is contraband." "So am I," Mason said, and pulled the injector free. He took a breath. Somewhere a protocol screamed. Somewhere else a future prosecution warmed its hands. He fitted a line to his own arm and watched his blood, bright and ordinary, fill the tube. His body knew the feeling. He had donated in barracks, on troop transports, in dusty clinics with posters where children's smiles were smudged by fingertips. This time, a microvector prey line swirled in the drip, like a galaxy curling inside a drop of red. The stitchers would rewrite themselves to speak Selenari and human at once, sculpting temporary bridges across incompatible rivers. It was madness. It was not enough. It was what he had. He tightened the clamp above Kelari's elbow and found purchase in the vein. It slid home. He pressed the release. Her eyes widened. "What are you borrowing time?" She inhaled as the first molecules met her heart. Pain rode up her throat like a wave. He saw it. She did not cry out. Selenari breath control was legend across the frontier. They could slow themselves into hibernation if need be. They could let their organs fold like flowers at evening. But this was different. He watched the monitors as the vector-spiked blood crossed the Great Divide, whispering to her cells like a stranger calling in a friendly accent. The numbers hesitated, quivered, then began to climb, drop, climb again like an animal learning a path. Kelari very slowly exhaled. "Your blood," she whispered. "It tastes of thunder, sweet of you to say. You risk much." He kept his eyes on the line, on the rate of flow. "Humans risk, we always have." She studied him. "We do," she corrected gently. Outside, something exploded, a dull whump of pressure as a fuel cell went without grace. The tense frame shivered. Somewhere a child wailed. Another sound shushed him, soft and tired. Mason worked. The transfusion marched on, liter by careful liter. The wound began to clot under the sealant, the ragged edges softened. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, unspooled finger by finger. He adjusted the flow to a trickle, letting her own system relearn itself. Then he closed the line and leaned back against the cot's thin rail, his own head light with the giving. Kelari watched the ceiling as if it held the old constellations of her home. "Why are you here, human?" she asked after a while. "Not Onver, in the galaxy. Other species found old star lanes carved by ancestors and drifted out like leaves. You take engines into seas that do not want boats. Why?" Mason thought. He could answer in 100 ways. Because Earth had been unlivable, then crowded again. Because their myths had always included ships. Because they had been told they were loud and crude and made of too much hunger and they wanted to become something else. Instead, he said, "We were tired of being alone." Her eyes turned to him, night sky and dawn flare. "We are never alone in the dark," she said. "Not if we listen. The dark is crowded." Then we wanted to add our noise. She almost smiled. Strange how it transformed her, as if her face had practiced the motion only in theory. "I believe you," she said and closed her eyes. He stayed with her until the storm began to move on and the ash settled into the gutters like old snow. He changed her dressings, adjusted fluids, ignored the ache in his own arm. He told her a simple story about the sea, Not the romantic kind with moonlight, but the stubborn gray that battered breakwaters. And the way a lighthouse kept watch, not because ships would always come, but because sometimes they would. She listened without pretending not to. His words threaded the silence like a mending line. She slept. Mason stood and stepped away, leaving his contact tag on the tray. He worked the rest of the night. He lost 3 who would not have been lost if the crash hadn't crowded the hallway, if the militia hadn't seized fuel, if the world were kinder. He saved a woman who'd been pinned beneath an exit beam, her husband holding the beam with raw hands because he was sure hope weighed something. Dawn started as a smudge on the horizon, and then, when the generators coughed back to life, as a slide of golden across metal. When Mason finally found a corner, he collapsed onto a stool and let himself breathe. That's when the grief hit. The sharp, punitive grief that comes when adrenaline departs and the ledger opens to tally your debts. He didn't see Selenari again for 3 days. The city tried to resume the art of standing. The militia agreed to stand down in exchange for relief shipments. The Arkship broke quarantine with a physician's declaration and a captain's curse. Mason slept 6 hours across 3 days, ate 2 ration bars he barely tasted, argued with 2 bureaucrats and 1 clever thief who thought sutures could be bargaining chips. He thought of the Selenari commander more than he admitted, as if some thread had been tied around his wrist, and he could feel its tug when he turned. On the 3rd day at dusk, when he was coaxing a child to sip water with promises of star stories, someone's shadow fell across the tent threshold. He glanced up, and the world seemed to correct its focus by a fraction. Selenari stood framed by the doorway, moving with care but no uncertainty. A new uniform lay smooth across her shoulders, the insignia gleaming as if they'd been newly forged from a fallen moon. The wound beneath was nearly healed, not a miracle, just a good design. Her gaze found him like betrayal and blessing both. "You should be in bed," Mason said, keeping his voice light. "I have been," she said. "I prefer standing." He nodded at the world outside. "There's a lot of that going around." Her eyes moved past the cots, past the tired faces. "I have come to thank you. Bring a plant next time," he said. "I can keep those alive." But she did not smile. She took a step closer, and he saw how her composure sat atop something else, puzzlement, edged with fear and wonder like a blade. "Your blood," she said. "It saved my life." That was the plan. And, she said, a small exhale twisting the air between them, "it made me pregnant." The tent did not tilt or shrink. It simply became very quiet inside him, the way a harbor goes still when fog arrives. He stared at her and, to his credit, did not laugh or speak or flick his eyes to the nearest paternity form as if bureaucracy could parse what biology had thrown on the table. Selenari continued, disciplined. Selenari reproductive systems are complex. We carry a dormant lattice, a scaffold that activates only when a particular chemical chorus sounds. Our blood hears it and begins the work of life. We call it seed sleep. It can wait decades, sometimes centuries. He remembered his anatomy classes, scraps from that woefully inadequate text. Selenari were a long-lived species whose fertility did not operate on human cycles. Their notion of family was not a closed circle, but a constellation that spanned time, with children born to mothers who might have slept through 3 empires and woken to find the world different and the ache of guardianship familiar. She went on, voice steady, because she had wrestled it into steadiness before coming. Your blood carried translators, and its iron lit our salt. It sang the chorus. The seed sleep woke. The lattice began to build. The medics confirmed with resonance mapping. There are cellular structures drawing from my body, from your donation. Mason realized he had been holding his breath. He let it go. Outside, someone laughed at a joke that wasn't good, and nearby a heart monitor ticked like a metronome. He sat down. Selenari watched him as if measuring what he might break. "This was not intent," she said. "I understand. I chose the risk when I accepted unauthorized treatment, but it is. A life, he said. Yes, he thought of the child on Mars who had survived and visited the clinic a year later, sand in her hair and a tooth missing. He thought of his sister's son on a wind farm in Saskatchewan, how he'd learned to run along catwalks before he learned to read. He thought of empty rooms and full skies. His imagination did something unfamiliar. It expanded past itself. "What do you call such a child?" he asked, because language can sometimes do the small kindness of making sense. "In our tongue," she said slowly, "a crossing. A bridge built by accident that becomes the only road anyone remembers." He nodded. Kelari held the edges of herself like armor. "I will carry this crossing," she said. "It is a vow woven into the Selenari bones, but I came to tell you because my physicians say your presence may be required. The lattice sings more stably when it hears both voices, and because—" her eyes flicked away, the first break in composure, "because I thought you should know what your courage opened." He stood. "I'm not running," he said with an honesty that surprised him. "I'm not very good at that." "No," she said, studying him. "I do not believe you are." They sat on folding chairs in a corner that smelled faintly of antiseptic and onion stew and told each other the abbreviated versions of their lives. He omitted the parts where he was young and guilty. She omitted the parts where she was older and terrifying. Their words moved like scouts across a river, feeling for rock. When lights out came and the tent dimmed and the city outside exhaled into night, she stood and bowed her head, not a soldier's salute, something older. "I will return," Kelari said. "My ship needs me, but we will come back to this world. We will need rebuilding. That work does not end. I'll be here." "I know," she said. "It is your flaw." He smiled. "We call it stubbornness." "It will do," she agreed and left. What followed were months measured not by calendars but by constructions. The militias' insignias became badges of service, and the spaceport's crater grew scaffolds like steel gardens. An alliance formed, poor, tired, but real, between humans who fixed things and Selenari, who remembered how worlds are meant to fit together. Arkship medics set up a clinic beside the human hospital, exchanging recipes for bread leavening and protocols for shock therapy. Mason learned to read Selenari facial stillnesses and to appreciate the way their laughter came in ripples, easy to miss if you weren't faithful. Kelari moved between command tent and assembly floor with an authority that made arguments quiet. The crossing grew. He didn't see the child, of course. There was no child. There was a quiet burgeoning beneath Kelari's armor, a change in the cadence of her walk, a hand that went absently to her side when she stood too quickly. Human gestation was a clock with a second hand. Selenari gestation was a season that measured itself in tides. The physicians, human and Selenari both, watched the resonance maps and argued softly about what they saw. The lattice built itself like a bridge in fog, both sure and unknowable. Sometimes Kelari came to the human hospital and sat in a chair while he changed dressings and coaxed stubborn intravenous ports to behave. She watched him work with the half-smile of an instructor whose student refuses to notice a trick he has learned as a craft. Sometimes he went to the Arkship clinic and stood beside a tank filled with luminous brine while a Selenari medic hummed a diagnostic, a melody that made the fluid quiver and told him what the notes meant. He learned new words: Mariel, the breath that guides a birthing body; Thren, the vow of guardianship that can be shared outside blood. They didn't make plans as much as they made sentences that leaned together. "When you go with the survey team," he'd say, and she'd tilt her head and reply, "when you learn to cook food with taste," while a Selenari apprentice pretended not to laugh. The child had a working name, not a proper one, Bridgelet, a clumsy human joke that made Kelari pretend to frown and then use it herself. He began to think of the future in non-hypotheticals. The city's first rain since the disaster came down in a curtain of silver, washing ash into the drains. Crowds cheered on balconies simply because the sky had remembered how. Mason took his remark to the roof and stood beneath it, head thrown back, arms spread, and when the water hit him he felt something rare, clean. He looked over and saw Kelari doing the same, her face lifted, the raindrops slipping across her night-bright skin and bead at her eyelashes. She lowered her head slowly and their eyes met. No words. The moment took a photograph of itself. Trouble arrived 2 weeks later wearing a uniform made of hunger and old orders. The militia wasn't done with their private future. They had made promises to men with fat watches on distant moons. An armored column rolled down the same spiral road the relief convoys used and stopped at the mouth of the port. Their leader broadcast a statement about control, about security, about how this city didn't know how to govern itself. It was a familiar speech. It had never saved a life. Kelari met them at noon, the sun a coin balanced on the edge of the sky. She took no weapon other than history and confidence. 3 of her officers stood behind her. Mason was in surgery repairing a cargo hauler's worker whose arm had met a careless gear. When he stepped out, someone handed him a recording. He watched Kelari in the high glare, speaking in a voice that could flatten waves. She told them about the strong who bully the tired. She told them about the long memory of broken deals and knives in the bread. She invited them to sit at a table. She told them they could not take this city unless they stepped over her, and if they did the whole galaxy would hear the sound of their boots. The militia leader, a man with eyes like dull marbles, laughed. "You aren't from here," he said. "This isn't your fight." Kelari's face changed. Not anger, not even disdain, something else. "I carry a child," she said, broadcast plainly. "Within me grows a life that belongs to this world and to another. This city's air has fed us both. My blood now carries dust. You think I am not of here. I am here in a way you never let yourselves be. I have tied my future to this dirt." The crowd around them murmured, rippling. Even the militia line shifted, some small part of calculation altered. Later, in the small hours, when the hospital hummed its midnight chord and rain whispered against the tent, Kelari came to find Mason. She stood in the doorway of the storage room where he was organizing leftovers, because some shadows only go where they are invited. He turned and he saw that she had used a lot of her strength today. "You shouldn't have told them," he said gently. "They could make it a target." "They will," she said. "They already have. But secrecy is a fortress with no windows. I need the light." He set the box down. "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "Hungry, angry, all 3 can be solved with bread." He laughed despite himself, a short startled sound. "Sit," he offered, and she did, leaning back against the wall, eyes closing and opening as if each was its own negotiation. He wanted to reach for her hand. He didn't. He sat and watched the rain choose its path down the plastic of the window. In a different world this would be a tender scene. In theirs, it was a pause aimed toward morning. The militia did not attack the next day. They waited, sent scouts, asked questions of the wrong people. The city grew wary. The alliance began quiet preparations that weren't war but weren't quite peace. And in that suspended balance, in the hour when night folds her tent and day pretends it's not a guest yet, Kelari woke in her quarters on the Ark ship with a ripple of sensation that made memory kneel. The crossing had chosen a moment. She stood with care and breathed the Mariel, a controlled spiral of breath patterns learned in temples older than steel. This was not labor, not as humans would call it. The Selenari gestation ended not in hours of contraction, but in a day of realignment, bones softening fractionally, organs making room with the grace of dancers. The lattice's last woven chords translated to what would be cells of memory. The medics came and hummed, their voices overlapping like gentle waves. Across the port, Mason woke when his comm pinged and the symbol on its face was not a general alert or a supply manifest but a single glyph he had learned early. Thren, guardianship request. He stood, adrenaline flowering, then stopped. He had one sock on, one off. He laughed once, helpless, and continued dressing because ridiculousness was one of the secret fuels of resilience. He ran the spiral road under a sky that thought about raining and decided against it. The birthing chamber was unlike any human room. It was not sterile in the dry, empty way. It was clean like a garden is clean. There was soft light and a sound that might have been water thinking about its glint. Kelari lay in a shallow pool that lapped against her skin. Her eyes found his and softened, which for her meant the stars in them set down their spears. He knelt beside the pool. "Tell me what to do." "Breathe with me," she said. "Sing if you can." "I can't sing." "Then talk," she said, a whisper. "Humans always do." He told her about the river in his home city that had iced over one winter so thick they'd built stalls on it. He told her about the time he'd thought he'd lost a patient and hadn't, because human error sometimes errs toward life. He told her about the tree in his grandmother's yard where he'd carved his name and then felt guilty for a week, and how he had apologized to the tree as if it could hear. She breathed and the medics hummed, and in that braided sound something that felt like courage grew teeth. When the moment came, it was quiet. Selenari births have no rupture, no rawness visible. They are an unfolding, an unveiling. Kelari reached down and lifted from the water a small body slick with the light of it. The child's skin was not her mother's midnight. It was a smoky twilight, threaded with veins that shone human red at the edges. The eyes were closed. The tiny chest rose and fell. Kelari did not cry in the human way. Tears were not how her people exhaled joy. But her voice broke on the hum she made, and Mason heard in it the sound of a world around a star. He reached out without thinking, and the child's fingers, impossibly small, grasped his thumb. A medic took a resonance scan, and a dozen glyphs danced across the field. Another hummed a chord that made the pool shiver with acceptance, and then Kelari spoke a word. "Aaron," she said. "In my language it means between, it means path, it means end." He repeated it. "Aaron." The door hissed and someone burst in with no ceremony because some thresholds are meant to be broken. It was a liaison from the city. His face was gray around the edges. "They're moving," he said. "The militia, 20 minutes, maybe 30, they have armor and a ground-boring charge." The room stayed still around the word charge even as hearts quickened. The liaison looked at the pool and at the child. "I'm sorry," he said, because the universe always delights in timing that would be melodrama if it weren't simply true. Kelari turned her head. She was pale as she could be and her hands shook, and something in her eyes that had never asked for mercy looked, for a fraction, as if it could. "Go," she said to Mason, because she could do command even when it slashed her. "They will break the port's gates. The hospital is in the blast range." "What about?" He looked at the child and the room in his hands. "What about?" "I am not alone," she said. "This is what Thren is for. Others will guard us. You do what you do. You stand where it hurts." He hesitated because one faces two wars at once and both ask for you. The Selenari medic, older than both worlds, placed a hand on his shoulder with the weight of a vow. "Go," she said. "We will not let the dark in here. That is your job out there." He went. He ran again, and the city was different now. It had edges. The spiral road had checkpoints where there had been fruit stands. The sky had tightened like a muscle. At the hospital, the triage tents were already half dismantled and rolled into armored shells. Patients who could were being moved. Many could not. Mason's team moved like a single organism composed of tired parts. This was what they had trained for without knowing. He saw the blast plan. The militia would come down the main thoroughfare with a boring charge set low to take out the footings of the port's eastern wall. The concussive wave would roll into the hospital like an invisible flood, tearing canvas, shattering supplies, turning needles into flies. The only counter was to move the vulnerable and harden what could not move. He had 30 minutes. He used 29 and 40 seconds. He moved vents and turned carts into shields and took doors off hinges and laid them like ribs. He barked and laughed and said good, 100 times because praise is both cheap and priceless. He looked up and saw the dust first, a dark rope. Then he heard, on the edge of hearing, the steady thunder of machines. The column came. The Selenari had taken positions along rooftops and in alleys, not with rifles but with the machines that build worlds, cutters that can lay steel like thread, projectors that make air into foam, anchors that cling to stone like stubborn thought. They were not soldiers who kill. They were builders who knew how to interrupt forces that tear. The militia's first wave hit a wall that wasn't there a minute prior. A grid of field emitters woven by Selenari engineers with a grace that could turn a wreck into a cradle. The vehicles snarled and bit like trapped beasts. The ground-boring charge hummed. Mason was inside when the hum rose. He stood with his back against the central tent's main pole and counted breaths the way Kelari had taught him without ever intending to. He had one hand on a child's shoulder, one on a gurney bearing a woman whose eyes had a knowledge of pain older than empires. He did not pray. He had learned a long time ago that his version of petition was action. But he felt something like prayer, the thin, bright line between despair and duty. The bomb went off. It was not a blossom of fire, but a bass note that swallowed the others. The eastern wall shivered, cracked, and then met itself again because 10 minutes before the Selenari had laced its joints with living anchors. The concussive wave hit the hospital and the re-rigged doors and carts and canvas took it like a boxer who knows a punch is coming and turns into it. Things flew. Then they landed. People screamed and then remembered how to breathe. Mason picked himself up from the floor and learned that his left shoulder was not a fan of impacts. He rolled it. "Status," he said. Voices answered. He moved toward the worst noise and found a support beam pressing a man's thigh into a shape it was never meant to have. He got 3 hands under it and then another appeared, strong, cool. He looked up and saw Kelari. "Aaron," he began, and then saw there were 3 Selenari with her, medics with their gowns wet and clean. She had left her child in the hands of a vow and come. "Life does not pause," she said, as if to herself. They lifted. The beam moved and the man slumped, and Mason felt the humans under his hands become heavier, which was a good sign. It meant they had chosen to stay. He set the splint. Beyond, another explosion rolled down the street, smaller, frustrated. The militia was meeting resistance it had not accounted for, a city that had decided whose it was. On the thoroughfare, the Selenari, with human volunteers, had turned construction cranes into barricades and thermoplastic into rivers that hardened under a new kind of gravity. The militia leader, who did not think of people as anything but numbers, had not considered that numbers can choose a direction. His men began to back. He shouted pretty words about honor and duty and regaining the future, but the future had stopped listening to him. The charge carried consequences for the militia, too. Half of their column was trapped between a carrier that had swallowed a rebar net and a wall that had grown teeth. When they tried to reverse, the road beneath was no longer a road. A team of human engineers who had never planned to be that brave jammed a length of pipe into a joint and locked down a tread. Whoops! Someone shouted and laughed, and the laugh was a weapon of its own kind, ridicule's spear, puncturing the balloon of swagger. By dusk, the militia had retreated. They did not surrender. They simply discovered that a city does not belong to whoever arrives with the loudest bang. The survivors of their foolishness were given water and bandages and an invitation to be citizens. Many took it. Mason found Kelari on the hospital steps. She was very still, her stillness full of tremor. She had blood on her sleeve that was not any color he had seen before. He moved to her side and placed his hand at the small of her back where he could anchor her if she fell. She did not, but she leaned a fraction. "Aaron?" he asked, and the single word was an inventory of his entire heart. "Safe," she said, and he let breath out of him that had been waiting for an hour. "Sleeping, the medics hum. They tease me for leaving. They are not wrong. They are not right either," he said. You weren't just leaving, you were returning to us. To us, she repeated, savoring the shape, we who stand in the open. He looked at the city. Lights were coming on, one by one, like ideas. The rain returned, and this time it did not ask permission. It washed the street clean in places where it had been too long since clean had visited. People raised their faces like flowers. A small child ran past with a shard of plastic as a sword, shouting, "I am a bridge." Because children overhear the things that matter and make them into games. They walked back to the Arkship slowly. Mason kept a pace matched to her steps, not faster, not slower. In the birthing chamber, Aaron slept in a warming cradle curled like a question mark. The Selenari medic nodded at Mason and then left them, as if a stage manager had seen a final scene ready to begin. Kelari approached the cradle. She looked at the tiny face for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was a thin rope across a canyon. "I did not think I would ever carry a child," she said. "My life. I gave it to command when the first war took my home's edge. There was no room for more. Now there is a room that is a world." Mason did not touch her, he touched the cradle's rim. "Do you regret?" she began, then stopped because the strong do not often allow themselves to ask such a question out loud. "No," he said. He surprised himself by adding, "I regret the things that made this kind of courage necessary, not the courage, not the consequence." "Good," she said. She reached for his hand finally, and their fingers laced, a universal language. "Your species is very loud," she added, soft, as if an affectionate complaint. "We try, keep trying." They went on. The city rose. The Arkship opened more than its doors. It opened its kitchens and stories, and the Selenari who had taught their children to carve memory into metal taught human children to sing numbers that kept oxygen honest. Aaron grew with the steady marvel of all infants. First a tightening of fingers, then the turn toward a voice, then the lurch that is learning to stand. His eyes were the color of dusk after rain. He laughed rarely, but when he did, the room was better at being a room. He knew the smell of steel and the cadence of the Mariel, and he would fall asleep in Mason's arms even when he refused everyone else, because some bonds ignore genealogy and count only the hours of being there. Kelari returned to work full-time because she was built for it, but she returned different. She made room for new words in her vocabulary, such as later and wait. She could laugh now with her whole face, and there were lines at the edges of her eyes that had not been drawn by sorrow. She stood on scaffolds at dawn and watched the city stretch. Once, at a ceremony dedicating the rebuilt Eastern Wall, she gave a speech that made soldiers cry and made Masons stand very straight. She told them that a wall is not a wall if it exists to keep people out. It is a wall only if it keeps people upright. Mason stayed. He said yes to a job in the new hospital that came with a small office where he put a plant he would later forget to water, because habits are longer than intentions. He found a rhythm. Shift, walk to the Arkship, whisper nonsense to Aaron that contained the gist of the universe, sleep like a stone dropped in clear water. Sometimes he woke at 3 a.m. and joined the stockroom staff in counting syringes because there is a peace in numbers that do not bleed. Sometimes he looked out at the city and felt the old grief like weather, and then he felt the new joy like architecture that would not fall in a storm. He did not notice when rumors began to braid themselves into the wider galaxy. News travels by routes that maps do not dream of. Merchant gossip, coded memos, a song a spacer hums as he checks a hull. The story changed as all stories do. It became about a human whose blood made an alien commandant pregnant in the middle of a war, and how the child spoke 3 languages by age 1.5 and could cut stone with laughter. It became a mad folktale about the time war ran into love and got confused. But in its bones, the story was simpler. 2 beings stood where it hurt, and then built something there. The militia leader who had been pushed out tried once more. He sent saboteurs to poison the clinic's water. They were caught, not because security was perfect, but because they tried to move through a city that now noticed itself. A fruit seller watched shadows. A child thought a bag looked wrong beside a drain. A Selenari apprentice followed a pattern that didn't fit the song of the morning. The poison was never poured. The saboteurs were not executed. They were given jobs counting rainfall. One of them would later build a windmill. Scouts from other worlds arrived, hunched, careful like cats. They wanted to know if the story was true. They wanted to know if humans were really so foolish as to mix blood and vow and war and nursery. They wanted to know if this crossing was a weapon. Kelari and Mason let them see what they could. They showed them a baby whose fist could wrap around a human thumb or a Selenari knuckle with equal contentment. They showed them a city where welders taught poets how to use torches because metaphor burns too. Some visitors left unchanged. Some stayed to learn how to make walls into ribs. One evening, after a day that had been long but not cruel, after an argument about funding models resolved without a curse, Mason found himself on the port's edge where the water took the sunset and broke it like glass to make a million small stones. Kelari stood there already, Aaron asleep against her shoulder, his breath a small bellows. The air smelled of salt and hot metal and bread. He took his place beside her without asking, because the distance between them was an old conversation that no longer required words. Aaron listened to a new song today, she said in a voice pitched to keep him sleeping. A worker sang while she scrubbed a weld he watched with his whole face. Mason leaned on the railing. He has the attention of a man at his first football game. I do not know what that is. It's a ritual where humans learn to shout at grass. Ah, she said solemnly, holy. He smiled, holy. They were quiet a while. The sun did its work with color. The city breathed below them, an animal that finally trusted the hand at its neck. Then he said softly, who will he be? All of the things, she said, and then some. He will bruise himself on the sharp corners of two worlds, and then he will make pillows for others. She looked at him. He will learn to endure. There is no better gift. You taught me that, he said. No, she said. You taught me to accept it. A gust of wind came, cool. Aaron stirred and made a small sound, the beginning of a word. Kelari rocked him with the precision of a pendulum that knew where center was. Mason looked at them, alien and human both, and felt the old earth ache, not of homesickness but of a triumph not measured in flags. They were a banner of another kind. He wondered how many children would exist because someone had watched them and believed a bridge could hold. The next crisis came not with guns but with a pathogen. It was boring to describe and terrifying to live. A fever that learned to copy itself among the city's young, human and Selenari both. It did not spare the crossing bloods. It obeyed no borders. The hospital had protocols and the Arkship had songs, and both helped some and not others. Mason did not sleep properly for 81 hours. Kelari stood in a ward of cots and learned to swab, though her hands were made for maps and swords. Aaron caught the fever on a Tuesday and kept it for 6 days that were both a lifetime and a minute. On the 5th day, Mason put his head in his hands. Kelari set hers upon it. He startled, then stilled. She had never done that. The weight of her palm was cooler than human and steadier than anything he had known. He breathed. We will not, she said, lose him. You cannot promise that. No, she said. I can vow it. He lifted his head and met her eyes and saw that vows in her tongue were not contracts with gods but with one's own backbone. They held. He took that into himself and held too. On the 6th night Aaron's fever broke. He slept for 14 hours and woke with a hoarse, annoyed sound and a specific hunger. Mason fed him and cried and laughed at the same time like a bad actor, and it was real. Kelari leaned back in the chair and allowed her body to finally realize the danger had passed and shook until it released. The pathogen left the city like a thief who had taken some but not all. They built a new lab in its memory, not made of marble, but of calendars with backup plans written in fat pen. The hospital learned how to store the right medicines, and the Ark ship taught the right songs. People told the story of the fever in the way people always will, with jokes that surrender to silence in the last line. Years moved. They always do. Aaron learned to run and then to fall and to laugh about falling and then to ask questions about the point of standing if one must fall. Mason taught him to throw a ball. Kelari taught him to throw a sentence where it needed to land. He grew used to watching his parents. He called them that though the words did not quite fit the Selenari equivalent, move through a world where each step changed the world, and he chose his steps carefully. He liked numbers and disliked silence unless it was chosen. He could hum a chord that made a light flicker on the Ark ship, and he could ask a human who was crying, "Would you like a bread?" Which had been Mason's favorite tending trick and now was Aaron's. One night a ship came that did not announce itself. It slid into the gravity well like a knife seeking meat. It bore no insignia. Its captain had read the rumors and thought, as lesser minds will, that this was a wealth to be stolen, a child of two worlds, a font of genetic and political leverage, a living key. The ship's engines quieted a kilometer out. Its bay opened like a mouth. 3 stealth craft fell toward the city. They almost made it. They might have once, when the city was new to itself. But now the city knew the weight of its breath. The rooftop sensors that measured rainfall noticed a new pattern in the night. The Ark ship's peripheral hum caught a discord. A human night watchman whose eye had been trained by grief saw a shadow that did not belong to the moon. Alarms sounded, not panicked but coherent. The stealth craft were nets thrown into a lake that had learned to swim. They hit a grid of light woven between buildings, the same trick as before but better, and they sizzled into shape. The city held its breath. Kelari stood beside Mason on the highest balcony of the port, their shoulders one line. Below them 1,000 people looked up at the same time and were not afraid. The interlopers did not land. They hung, caught as herons caught in wires. A broadcast came from the parent ship, a demand, a threat, a bored litany of terms. Kelari answered on a channel that everyone could hear. She did not bother to list their crimes. She did not explain the calculus of care. She said simply, "This place is not available." The ship tried to burn through with an engine flare. The Ark ship made a choice Mason had not known it was capable of. Its hull opened along seams that had not opened in a century, and it showed teeth. Not cannons, not missiles, anything anyone with a human education would recognize. It showed a field so old it was new again, a gravity trick the Selenari had teased into obedience long before humans crawled out of home seas. It did not destroy the ship. It persuaded it that leaving was in accord with every law of nature. The ship went. The city went back to sleep eventually. Mason and Kelari stayed a while on the balcony, not victorious, just awake. Aaron slept in a room whose window faced a courtyard where someone had planted trees. He would wake in the morning and ask for bread. The galaxy would hear about the night's failed theft and would say what it always says: that the small resist, that the stubborn survive, that the bold breed stories. Mason turned to Kelari. "Do you think," he asked, "this ever ends?" "Whatever," she asked softly, not to tease. "The work, the building, the holding," she thought, because answers deserve to be chosen with patience. "No," she said, "because what ends dies. We are not trying to die, we are trying to live. Living is work. We are good at work." He nodded. He looked out at the dark and thought of all the places on the maps that were still blank, and how humans drew monsters in the spaces until they had courage to sail there. He thought of the way Selenari sang to their ships and the way the ships hummed back. He thought of blood and bridges and vows. The next morning, Aaron brought him a small, lopsided loaf of bread he had kneaded himself. It tasted like determination and too much yeast. It tasted perfect. As years layered themselves into a sediment of memory, the city named a square after the first day of rebuilding. They carved under its plaque a phrase in Selenari and human script both: "We do not rebuild, we continue." The The square filled with market stalls every third day, and Aaron ran through them with a speed that made stall owners lunge and laugh. He grew into a boy who could speak to the arkship in hums and to the cranes in commands. He asked questions that stackbled it in the air, and often Kelari would look to Mason and he would shrug, because children are riddles without answers, and answering them is how you get to be surprised. One evening Aaron asked, "Why did you give your blood to Mother?" Mason answered carefully, "Because I did not want her to die." "Is that why I am here?" "In a way," Mason said, "because we tried to stop one ending and gave a beginning a chance to show up." Aaron considered. "Will my blood help someone else if they need it?" "Maybe," Mason said. "Maybe not. What matters is that you will try." "Then I will," Aaron said, and returned to his bread as if the conversation had been a note added to a recipe. Kelari watched and smiled, a complete one. "He is," she said, "a very loud child." Mason grinned. "It's the human." "It is," she agreed. "And it is good." The galaxy, for all its drama, does not remember every name. It forgets heroes and holidays, misplaces the reasons for monuments, tells jokes that once belonged to tragedies. But sometimes it keeps a story because it needs it. On a station orbiting a brown dwarf whose light barely earned the word, a bartender told a freighter crew about Ver and the crossing child, and the woman whose blood ran with dusk, and the man whose blood had run with iron. On a pastoral world where seasons cudgel rather than caress, a teacher told a classroom about a city that learned to be itself. In a pirate bay where the air smelled like burned sugar and the laughter like knives, someone told a story and then set down a knife and went to find an honest job. Across the old star lanes, the rumor worked. None of that mattered on a day when a pipe burst on the hospital's third floor, and Mason had to wade through ankle-deep clean water with a wrench in his hand, while Kelari handled an off-world delegation whose leader kept trying to pretend the floor wasn't sloping. None of that mattered the night Aaron lost his first tooth and bled a little, and then was so proud he could barely stand it. None of that mattered until it did, when a refugee ship limped in from a border skirmish and asked, tentatively and then with relief, for the particular mercy of this port. Years again. The city taught itself to be old without being tired. One afternoon Kelari sat on a bench in the square with Aaron, now taller and full of angles. He watched two children argue over a data pad and then decide to share it in a way that included neither sulking nor punching. He looked at his mother. "Is everyone like us now?" he asked. "Crossed?" "No," she said, "but they are crossing, between their fears and their futures." She ruffled his hair, a human gesture she had stolen. "That is enough." He nodded. He had learned that enough is a word with a backbone, and then, as if to close a circle, the militia leader returned, not to fight but to die. He had been broken by his own ambition in places a doctor can't mend. He knelt on the hospital steps and asked for care. There were people in the crowd who wanted to spit and people who wanted to cheer for his ruin. Mason came to the door. Kelari stood behind him. They looked at each other and the city held its breath. "Bring him in," Mason said. They did. The care was ordinary, the best kind: fluids, rest, a shoulder to lean on. The man wept once alone where a camera could not catch it and twist it into anything else. He left weeks later with a job fixing pipes and a heavier silence. No documentary was made. No plaque was carved. It was not drama. It was the boring heroism of refusal to be cruel. On a day when the sun refused any artistic flourish and shone like a laborer, the arkship announced a departure window. It would not leave forever. The Selenari do not think of their ships as arrows shot toward a destination, but as hands that reach and return. There were tears. There were speeches improved by brevity. Kelari stood on a dais and told the city with plain joy that she would return often, that she had planted roots and hung a lantern and could not pretend otherwise. Mason stood below her and thought how strange and dear this life had become, and then Aaron tugged his sleeve because he had seen a stall selling honeyed nuts and that was a priority. That night when quiet finally took the port, Mason and Kelari watched the open dock. "When we first met," she said, "I thought you were a fool." "I was." "You were," she agreed. "The noblest kind. The fool who refuses to count costs as if they were coins and people as if they were furniture." She turned to him. "I have commanded a fleet. I have negotiated treaties with species who think in hexameter. I have broken sieges with a song. But this," she gestured at the city, the square, the window where a plant mason had forgotten to water still hung on. "This is the work that matters." "We did it together," he said, "because truth should be said out loud or they wither." She inclined her head. "We did." They stood a while longer. Aaron inside snored softly, a new habit he denied. The water in the basin below the port lapped with the patient touch of a craftsperson palming a curve smooth. The stars were less like knives tonight, more like candles. "Do you miss Earth?" Kelari asked suddenly. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't miss who I was there. I like the version of me the galaxy made." "She is brutal," Kelari said of the galaxy. "She is," he agreed. "But she doesn't have to be, not always." They looked at each other. Both had aged by the measure of those who learn to build. Kelari's hair had silver not of her species' light but of time. Mason's hands were more careful and his temper less. They had learned each other's shadows and had stopped being surprised by them. In years to come, Aaron would take a ship that bore both names, Human and Selenari, and go down the old star lanes with a crew that laughed too much and sang too loud. He would refuse to carry weapons and learn that sometimes the best shield is a joke at the proper moment. He would return often and tell stories about storms and quiet rescues. He would fall in love with a scientist who collected ancient seeds, and he would teach their children to hum. He would be a bridge as daily as bread, as ordinary as sunrise, as astonishing as any kindness. History would be unkind again, it always is. Wars would arrive dressed in rationality and leave in rags. Plagues would learn new math. Markets would pretend to be gods. But inside the math of survival, inside the dressings and tribunals and weldings and births, a single truth would stand. When it mattered somewhere, someone would give blood they could not spare. Somewhere, someone would choose to carry a life that asked to be carried. Somewhere, a city would decide to be a we and that we would hold. On the day Mason finally stopped working, not because he was tired but because he was allowed, he took a walk through the square. It was market day. The air smelled of peppers and cool steel and a spice he could not name. Children ran noisy, elders watched, amused. He stopped at the wall with the plaque and touched the carved words. A Selenari mason beside him, gray-haired and wide-shouldered, nodded at the gesture. "You built this," the mason said. "We all did," Mason replied. Later he climbed the spiral road to the port where Kelari waited as she always did, as if this were the first day and not the 1000th. They stood together and the light painted them both honest. Below, the city hummed with the old new song of work. He looked at her and felt grateful in a way that didn't require an object, only a direction. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For enduring." She lifted a shoulder. "We had help." They watched the water wait for the tide. They watched a young crew check a ship's lines. They watched a child in a stroller point at the sky and say something no one understood and treasure it anyway. Mason took Kelari's hand and felt the cool steadiness of her bones. The wind moved around them, gentle for once. The war had ended 1,000 years ago in another galaxy and another story, and yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. But alongside those scars were other marks, the lines where stitches took, the seams where two skins learned to hold one body. These were in the end the maps that mattered. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.